There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn Breeze Books, and welcome to the 8th annual Besties and Worsties on my channel. I just had to confirm that. The first one was in 2017, and here we go. In the last few years, I have debuted a new blouse, and so I have been keeping this one a secret from y'all and from anybody who knows me here in town until tonight. I just love it. So I hope you do too. And as usual, I have a ton of awards. I've actually had a really good reading year, despite all the personal stuff. If you've been following me this year, you know all about it. I'm not going to dwell on it here. But I now realize my reading numbers, and I don't reveal them publicly because I just don't want to encourage that kind of nonsense competition on BookTube or Bookish social media. But it was only about a third less than, or something like that, than usual. So, you know, and what I might have lost in quantity, I sure made up for in quality. This was an amazing reading year. I have loved so many books that I couldn't even fit them all into this Besties and Worsties. So, with that being said, and a bottle of wine just opened 30 seconds ago, let the games begin. The first award is the best opening line or paragraph, and I have a tie for this. The first one is the novel Matterhorn by Karl Marlantes, which you would think wouldn't be a Shawn book. It's about American soldiers in Vietnam in the 60s or 70s, but it was just a very fine novel, and I did it on audio. I'll talk more about it a little later in this video, but the opening scene was to die for. And that might actually be a pun. If there is one main character, and I guess there is, it would be Melis. And he is I forget what he is, if he's a sergeant or... It's not a general, I don't think, but he's up in the chain of command in the Marines. Melis stood beneath the gray monsoon clouds on the narrow strip of cleared ground between the edge of the jungle and the relative safety of the perimeter wire. He tried to focus on counting the other 13 Marines of the patrol as they emerged single file from the jungle, but exhaustion made focusing difficult. He also tried, unsuccessfully, to shut out the smell of the shit, which sloshed in the water that half-filled the open latrine pits above him on the other side of the wire. Rain dropped from the lip of his helmet, fell past his eyes, and spattered onto the satiny olive cloth that held the armor plating of his cumbersome new flak jacket. The dark green t-shirt and boxer shorts that his mother had dyed for him just 3 weeks ago clung to his skin, heavy and clammy beneath his camouflage utility jacket and trousers. He knew there would be leeches clinging to his legs, arms, back and chest beneath his wet clothes, even though he couldn't feel them now. It was the way with leeches, he mused. They were so small and thin before they started sucking your blood that you rarely felt them unless they fell on you from a tree, and you never felt them piercing your skin. There was some sort of natural anesthetic in their saliva. You would discover them later, swollen with blood, sticking out from your skin like little pregnant bellies. I guess I should have put a bit of a content warning on that, but, you know, we're all grown-ups here. Very memorable opening to an absolutely amazing novel. And the other best opening paragraph goes to The Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon by Beth Brower, Volume 1. It was the opening that hooked me, that intrigued me enough to start reading the series. I've now read the first 3 volumes. This is a serial work of fiction set in about 1880 in London with a rather badass young heiress who is being cheated out of her fortune by her, I think it's a great uncle-in-law or something that she calls her cousin. And she's forced to live in the house with him, but she is just a ball of fire, and it's a very funny series, and I'm getting more invested with each volume. Here's how it opens. This is more than a paragraph, but it's about the same length as the last one. March 5th, and it's diary entries. I've arrived in London without incident. There are a few triumphs in my recent life, but I count this as one. My existence of the last 3 years has been nothing but incident. The train billowed its way into St. Pancras Station 5 minutes early. Auspicious, as I'm fairly certain such a thing has never before happened in the history of the British railway system. A less than enthusiastic porter helped me with my 2 trunks, my case, and my hat box. He took note of the frayed edges on my morning coat, made a sound of disapproval, and began to silently convey his displeasure at helping me. I did give him a halfpenny, rather generous considering my financial state. Strangely, it was the hat box that caused the greatest sneer, despite it actually carrying a hat. For over a year it carried something a modicum less pleasant, the monkey's head Maxwell gave me. I almost crossed that out, the bit about the monkey's head. In Bournemouth, I developed a rather unfortunate habit of redaction, seeing as how Cousin Mathilde was no respecter of personal belongings, as proven by the Great Burning of 1882. The tendency to assume I've no privacy has persisted despite my best efforts, but I'm determined to break it. This journal does not deserve to have a foul black mark running through every incriminating thought. I will no longer censor myself. I digress. I forgot to hold up the book. It's a rather nondescript, self-published cover, but here it is, and it's well worth your time if that appealed to you. The next award is for Sexiest Writing or Scene, and no, I'm not going to read to you. This video would go too long if I read everything. It's the 1995 gay male novel from the UK, Now and Then by William Corlett. The now of the story is in present-day London, which would have been in the 90s probably, but the then is the gay male protagonist's boarding school days when he not only fell in love with one of his classmates, but was evicted from the school because of that love affair, and it has damaged him to this day. The writing of the sexual exploration of these two 15 or 16 or 17-year-olds is among the most erotic and tender writing about gay male sexuality. It is not gratuitous, it is essential to the plot, it is essential to the awakening and the trauma that being gay in the 50s or whatever it was entailed. This was a reread. I think I actually started at the end of last year but finished it in early January. I loved it even more than the first time. It's one of the best gay novels that's ever been written. Next is the best cover. And I felt self-conscious last year about giving an award for the best cover because it kind of implies that was my favorite thing about the book, and that is absolutely not true. But this is, hands down, the best cover of any book I read this year. Birding by Rose Ruane. I read this in the second half of the year and loved it. I did an interview with the queer Glaswegian author Rose Ruane on this, her second novel, and in conversation with the queer Montreal novelist Christopher Dorado. That book, which I love too, and unfortunately, like I say, read so much great stuff, it's not going to show up here, but oh my god, I love The Family Way by Christopher Dorado. But that novel and Birding shared the exact same epigraph from The Little Prince, and so we had a fabulous conversation. Birding is a novel about two kind of down and out women. One is maybe middle-aged and the other is maybe approaching middle age. The older one, kind of an old maid who's been living with her mother and being completely dominated by her eccentric mother since the divorce in that family 20, 30 years ago, and is subjected to just incredible control by her mother. And the other character is a former pop star. I think she was famous in the 90s for about 10 minutes. People still remember that one song they sang, but she, since those halcyon days, or maybe they weren't so halcyon, that's a big part of the story, has been kind of lost with addiction and sexuality challenges and misogyny. And these two women in Glasgow, fairly close to the present, although I can't remember the timing exactly, they kind of cross paths in a fabulously explosive and dramatic and transformative way. It's a marvelous novel. Okay, here we go. The next award is the book I wish I had bailed on. And this book is popular including among probably people that are watching this video, so feel free to just to skip over this. But the award for the book I wish to hell I'd bailed on is the Irish novel Strange Flowers by Donald Ryan. I didn't hate it, but I almost hated it. I really deeply disliked it. And that's the second very subpar novel by him that I've read, so I won't read anything else he's written. He is a writer with a big heart, but he doesn't know how to write, really. He doesn't know how to... Well, if he stayed in his lane. The Irish countryside characters in this novel were really well drawn, and there was an interesting story there, but he insisted on... he expanded the scope of it to bring in non-Irish characters and just botched that part of the story. Editing Shawn here. I realized as I was editing this part of the video that I only gave you a small portion of my critique, and that portion standing alone, you might think I was being way too negative. The even more fundamental flaw of this novel is that while the character work is nuanced in some ways, the characterization suffers fatally from over-sentimentalization. The good characters are just too good, unbelievably good, so that I ended up sort of kind of hating them. And I was prevented from sinking down into the story. The characters were not believable. I just don't see what all the fuss is about with Donald Ryan, and maybe I'll leave my rant at that, but I thought it was quite awful. But do check out other people's reviews of this novel, because it's a very well-liked, if not loved, novel. And the next one of my favorite awards is for favorite character, and this is also a tie. And the first award goes to the titular character of this incredible and tragically obscure Canadian novel, Ivy's Tree, by Wendy Burton. The protagonist, Ivy, at the opening of the novel, she's a North Vancouver Canadian widow. She's been widowed less than a year. She's in her 70s. I've forgotten exactly how old she is, but she seems older than her years because she's so burdened by grief that she's really having trouble putting one foot in front of the other or making any kinds of decisions. And her adult daughter, with whom she's never really gotten along, and who is living in Tokyo with her Japanese husband, phones her and says, "Mom, get your butt over here. There's nothing there in Vancouver for you now. Dad's gone. Come and live with us." And despite how awful her daughter has always been to her, she sells the house and goes. And it's just an indication of how bewildered she is in the depths of her grief. And she goes to Tokyo, and it doesn't go well. And I loved Ivy so much because there is a trajectory where, and I'm not going to give very much away, I did a full-length interview with Wendy Burton, which I'll link in the show notes. I'm very passionate about people seeking out this book, which is available worldwide, certainly on ebook, but even in physical form. The way she finds her way back to herself and asserts herself in this really abysmally dysfunctional family dynamic in Tokyo was just a joy to read. I love Ivy. She's a real living, breathing person to me, and this novel is amazing. It's not a secret, I don't think, that this is my top read of the year. The 2022 American novel, The Deluge, by Stephen Markley. And one of the key characters is Ash, and he is, I believe he's a Pakistani American. He's on the autism spectrum, and he's queer. And he's kind of a Spock-like character until you get farther into the novel and you realize that he is actually at the heart of this novel. And, well, he does have this Spock-like aura about him. He was the character that I connected on the deepest emotional level with. He is brilliant. I think he's oh God, what is he? He's a statistician or something, but he's so brilliant at what he does that after being involved in, I think, the stock market or something, he ends up getting involved in the statistical side of the initiatives about climate change that are the preoccupation of this novel. And I'll talk more about this novel a little later, but he was in so many ways the beating heart of the novel, and he wrote in a very intellectual style in the form of memos to his superiors, but threaded like a pulsing vein through those memos is his beautiful big heart. Oh, I loved Ash so much. And just in case I forget to mention it later, or if you don't watch that part, Stephen Markley was my mystery guest just a couple of weeks ago. Wow, what a get that was. We had a fabulous conversation about The Deluge, and you must check it out if you missed it. There's a link in the show notes. It's been a few years since I gave an award for my most hated character, but there is one this year. I haven't quite finished the novel, so it won't be on my 2024 reading list. I'll probably finish it later this week, but I'm far enough, 80% I think, in to know, and I've already talked about this, that the sister character in this British novel, Christ on a Bike by Orla Owen, she just pushes my buttons. That's an understatement. I just couldn't stand her to the point where, and this is not a comment on the quality of this novel, but more a comment on my idiosyncrasies as a reader, to the point where it detracted from my enjoyment of the novel. She is her big sister, I think it's her big sister, the protagonist, Karis, comes into an inheritance out of the blue. And she's not allowed to share it with anybody, including her younger sister, who is married with kids. That's Saren. And Saren is just so spitefully jealous and gives off such a poisoned and self-poisoning vibe that I really couldn't stand to be in her head. And I was forced to be in her head for, I would say, for this particular reader, too much of the novel. That's all I'll say. I think I wasn't supposed to loathe her. I'm probably going to be talking to Orla Owen about this novel once I've finished, and I'll be curious to see if she intentionally made her to be so loathsome, but I certainly found her to be so. So I'm reviving one of my previous very popular awards. I haven't had any candidates for this award for a few years, but I sure do now. The award used to be known as the Pukeworthiest paragraph, but here I'm giving the Pukeworthiest sentence, although I am going to read you the better part of a paragraph to set it up. I'm not going to list this book in my show notes. I will put the GIF up here, and I'm going to read you the sentence, but I don't, this is a debut. I think it's a debut. It's certainly probably a young novelist, and I don't want to draw attention. I've already included this sentence in my Bale review. So, Ari Shin, a Korean-American writer, and the title is Spring on the Peninsula. I'll read you, about half of the long paragraph leading up to the sentence. The protagonist is bemoaning the end of a relationship, I believe is the context. At age 34, my lover had lost all ambition. No, he never had any to begin with. His annual contracts were never renewed. There is nothing sorrier than a pretty but useless person. He was weak and insincere, betraying me by changing his mind at the last second about following me here. He thought he could, but he could not, he wrote. He lied to himself and me about having a future together. And then he changed his mind about changing his mind, leading me on for a year as I groveled by letter and phone. I begged him to reconsider, even as I myself had begun to lose hope, pass into boredom. That last phase was memorable, a slow, billowing premonition, an unease that came down with such heft that I became flatulent most of the time. So, I think you can see why I hated that particular sentence at the end. The rest of it's not terrible, but this is really early in the novel, like maybe the first chapter or something, and I'd been struggling a bit with some of the prose, and when I got to that line, it's like, okay, I'm out of here. I hope this Besties and Worsties is not causing any of you to become flatulent most of the time. What does it mean, most of the time? What time period are we talking about? In happier news, the next award is for the best conclusion, and this is also a tie, because I want to talk about as many books as I can, and I'm watching the time. This is not going to be ridiculously long. The first one I'm not going to read from the conclusion, because it would definitely be a spoiler. But this is the Palestinian novel Minor Detail by Adanya Shibli, translated from the Arabic by Elizabeth Jaquette, a 2020 translation. It is a novella. It shook me to the core, and it's about how do you talk about it? The first half is set in the summer of 1949, 1 year after the Nakba begins in the Middle East, in Palestinian territory. A bunch of Israeli soldiers capture and rape a young Palestinian woman. She's not actually Arabic. She is, I've forgotten, but she's from a different ethnicity. I think kind of a nomadic tribe, but I've forgotten those details. And then the second half of the story is set basically in the present. A young woman in Ramallah becomes fascinated with this incident, this minor detail of history. And it comes to a dramatic and heart-wrenching conclusion. A deeply impactful read, and boy, the ending sure was. The other awesome conclusion to a novel was the Booker Prize winning Orbital by Samantha Harvey, and it is not spoilery at all, so I'm going to read the closing paragraph. God, the writing in here was just sublime. So it's about a bunch of astronauts in space. That's all you really need to know to fall into this final paragraph. And the Earth, a complex orchestra of sounds, an out-of-tune band practice of saws and woodwind, a spacey, full-throttle distortion of engines, a speed-of-light battle between galactic tribes, a ricochet of trills from a damp rainforest morning, the opening bars of electronic trance, and behind it all, a ringing sound, a sound gathered in a hollow throat, a fumbled harmony taking shape, the sound of very far-off voices coming together in a choral mass, an angelic sustained note that expands through the static. You'd think it'll burst into song, the way the choral sound emerges full of intent. And this polished bead planet sounds briefly so sweet. Its light is a choir. Its light is an ensemble of a trillion things which rally and unify for a few short moments before falling back into the rin-tin-tin and jumbled tumbling of static galactic woodwind rainforest trance of a wild and lilting world. Can you say gasp-worthy, boys and girls? The next award is one of my favorites, the best sentence. I do Sunday sentences. I don't do them as often as I used to, but I do them still occasionally, where you post the best sentence in anything you read that week. And here are 3 from that list over the year. The first is from this 2024 Indigenous novel, Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange, which I absolutely loved. And one of the characters in the second half, who is finding himself through Indigenous musical performance. The young Indigenous man is incarcerated. That is the word. If you're talking about residential schools in North America, the only acceptable verb is incarcerated. He was incarcerated at a residential school. And the musical instrument that he's playing is the trumpet, is the context for this sentence. The song he played was not a song, and not even a lament, and not an alarm, but like a call from a broken bird whose throat and beak had become elongated through some trial of pain meant to break him, but only ended up transforming him into something longer stretched, and into his song, with these notes that kept stretching after he stopped playing them, that sang about everything we'd been feeling all along, stuck in our suits and dresses, in that school and without our language. He was making music find it for him, his lost tongue and all of ours. The next one is much shorter, but packs a wallop, punches above its weight, as they say, and that is from the Brazilian novel The Love of Singular Men by Victor Heringer, translated from the Portuguese by James Young. We lived under the weird dictatorship of childhood. We looked but didn't see, listened but understood nothing, spoke and were largely ignored. And the third award for the best sentence is also from Orbital by Samantha Harvey, and I have read a long sentence already, but here's another one that I can't not read to you. And I don't even remember which of the characters is thinking all this, but it doesn't matter. Just listen to this sentence. And then a spike in sound as she thought of that great city Alexandria, and of nuclear disarmament, and the symphony of the earth's tides, and the squareness of his jaw, and the way he spoke with such bright precision, so that everything he said was epiphany and discovery, and the way he looked at her, as though she were the epiphany he kept on having, and the thud of her heart, and the flooding of heat about her body, when she considered what it was he wanted to do to her, and the migration of bison across a Utah plain, and a geisha's expressionless face, and the knowledge of having found that thing in the world which she ought never to have had the good fortune of finding, of two minds and bodies flung at each other at full dumbfounding force, so that her life had skittered sidelong, and all her pin-boned plans just gone like that, and herself engulfed in a fire of longing, and thoughts of sex and destiny, the completeness of love, their astounding earth, his hands, his throat, his bare back. Woof, I need a cigarette. That should have actually maybe won the Best Sex Writing Award. Oh my god, that's lovely. I'd forgotten how lovely that was. The next is the award for favorite short story. I didn't read very many short stories this year, which is sad. But even if I'd read a whole bunch more, it still would have gone, I think, to this story by my friend and one of my favorite writers, the newly Saskatoon-based Western Canadian novelist and short story writer, Shawn and her most recent collection of short stories, Season of Fury and Wonder, which came out 2018. And what she has done with this collection is she has taken a bunch of her favorite short stories. There's a couple that are not short stories. I think one is a poem and another one is maybe a short novel or something. But most of them are her favorite short stories. And for every one of those stories or literary texts, she has used it as an inspiration to write her own story about an elderly Western Canadian woman. I love the concept, I love the execution, and my favorite of the whole bunch is the first one, which was in homage to Raymond Carver. The title of her story is What Else We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And this is about an elderly Western Canadian woman. She's going to visit her sister. I believe their sister lived in Winnipeg. And our protagonist is a bit grumpy. I don't know where Sharon got that from. And doesn't really want to go because she's never really cared too much for her brother-in-law, and he's on his last legs, still living at home, kind of hospice care at home type of thing. And her sister, who she does at least complicatedly love, is also, if not dying, very ill and not really able to look after her husband, who is on his last, who is at the end of life. The protagonist goes to Winnipeg to visit them, and she doesn't want to go, and she's kind of cranky the whole the trip there, and it's arduous. It's probably in winter. And in one of those profound twists that probably she can't explain how it came to her. I think I've actually talked to her about this, but I'm not going to put words in her mouth. But as a reader, one of those twists that just changes the world. Something happens for her when she's in the dying brother-in-law's room that, I'm going to repeat the phrase, changes the world. I shall never forget it. Next is the award, a book that has stayed with me or is aging well. In other words, a book that, I liked it at the time, but I like it even more now that I've had more time to think of it. One of them is Minor Detail by Adanya Shibli, translated from the Arabic by Elizabeth Jaquette. I'm not going to say any more than what I've said before, but yes, this one has stuck in my throat and pricked my heart in a way that I can't give voice to, but wow. The next one of a book that stayed with me and is aging well is Ronan Hession's third novel, Ghost Mountain, which came out this year. And I loved it. It was a 5-star read. It is his best work, I think, in my humble opinion. And I can't stop thinking about it because I don't think I got everything. And I'm not even sure a second reading would fix that, if that's something that needs to be fixed. It's a very unusual premise. Some town, it's presumably in the Britain somewhere. Everybody in the town wakes up and a mountain has pushed itself out of the earth, and there's a mountain there, Ghost Mountain. The characters are indelible, and I'm not sure what it all means. And I can't stop thinking about it. So that is the sign of a very fine novel indeed. The next award is for the most vivid setting. And hands down, that goes to the Irish novelist Cavalry Madavans. I think it's her fifth novel, The Inheritance, which came out this year. And it is set in the Beara Peninsula, Glengarriff, which is where Cavalry herself lives, in County Cork. A London Irish lad inherits his Catholic priest uncles. The last one has died, and the house that he lived in this part of Ireland is left to this guy, 29-year-old Marlowe. And he moves there in the opening of the novel, and it is such a richly described, evocative setting. It really is the main character. And as a reader who often doesn't pay attention to setting, this was a joy to sink into. Not only the lives, quirks, and loves and traumas of the characters, but the smells and sights and sounds of life in the Beara Peninsula. Also, Cavalry's best. I have a chat with both of them together about these fabulous novels. That will be linked in the show notes. The next award is for the most surprising bail, and guess what? It's a tie. I'm not going to say too much about these, but I was surprised that I didn't get along with and couldn't finish the queer Puerto Rican American writer Justin Torres, his second novel, Blackouts. I didn't like it. Didn't like it at all, really. Couldn't finish it, even though it was supposed to be a discussion with Alex of the wonderful book podcast, the Hamilton Review of Books podcast. And I almost considered pretending I'd read it and just talking about what I didn't like, but I couldn't do that. So in the podcast, I fess up to Alex that I didn't like it, couldn't finish it. And it was actually a lovely chat about queer literature. I loved Torres's debut, We the Animals, but this one was just a little bit too experimental, and I thought unsuccessfully so. Lots of people loved it. Not me. The other one was an Edna O'Brien novel. I think it might have been her 7th or 8th. I didn't check that, but her 1977 novel, or perhaps novella, Johnny, I Hardly Knew You. The American title was just I Hardly Knew You. And Edna O'Brien is one of my favorite writers, but I had just had it up to here with her sexually and romantically obsessed female protagonists who are typically fall in love with men that are, they can't have. They're often married men. In this novella, it was her son's best friend that she fell in love with. And there's just a lot of over-the-top yearning and navel-gazy nonsense. And I mean, when she's not dwelling on that, or even sometimes when she is, but in this case, I just thought, you know what? Her mid-career stuff, it's all like this. This was the third one in a row, and I had been doing a chronological, completist kind of buddy read of Edna O'Brien's works with Sonia of An Enthusiastic Reader, and we both thought, you know what? We're done. So that was a surprising bail. And then she died, and her early work, and perhaps her later work, but it's not set in Ireland, so I don't care about it, but her early work, the first 4 or 5 novels she wrote, including the trilogy, the Country Girls trilogy, is some of the best fiction I've ever read. The next award is for the most moving passage or scene, and that, I'm not going to read it to you because it would be a spoiler, but that is from the 2024 novel My Friends by Hisham Attar, a Libyan-American writer who lives in the UK. It is a crime against humanity that this didn't at least advance to the shortlist for the Booker. It is the story of a young Benghazi boy who comes to Edinburgh, I believe, to study, to go to university, and gets politicized in favor of the anti-Gaddafi movement, goes to London with his classmate to demonstrate outside the Libyan embassy in London. And the staff at the embassy, and this is a true historical event, opened fire on the protesters. And our protagonist, Khalid, and his classmate friend are both wounded, quite seriously. There's a lot of moving things in here, but the scene that absolutely ripped my heart out is after he's been out of the hospital a few months and has been encouraged to stay in London, not go back to Edinburgh, but to stay in London under some kind of quasi-protection of whoever the anti-Gaddafi movement are, or maybe also the British authorities, and never to go back to Libya while Gaddafi's in power. He's so lonely. He doesn't know a soul in London, and he goes back for a checkup with the doctors that treated him in the hospital. He was in hospital for a long time, and just the abject loneliness and lostness of this young man, I think he's 18 or something, just broke my heart. In many ways, this is a cold novel. Oh, it's one of the best novels I read this year, and that scene in particular is imprinted on my soul. Can I put it that way? On my third glass of wine? I think I can. Oh, this is also one of my favorite awards. We had my favorite sentence, but this is the award for the goofiest, bestest quote of the year. And again, a three-way tie. I'm not going to set them up because this video is starting to go long. So without any context at all, here is the first one from Elizabeth Jane Howard, one of my favorite writers, Something in Disguise, which was published in the 60s, 1969. Without any context, please enjoy. The trouble with satin, even cut on the cross, was that it fitted you as long as you didn't move at all. The moment you did, great rifts and creases and undercurrents of strain determined themselves. This had happened at every fitting, and an angry woman in mildewed black, who combined a strong odor of cheddar cheese with the capacity to talk with her mouth bristling with pins, had stuck more pins into the dress, and Alice, with no lasting effect. The next one, again, with no context, and the context is very interesting, but you'll be hearing more about this later, from the work of autofiction, The Hearing Test by Eliza Barry Callahan, which was a 2024 release. I told him that I had regretted not becoming an architect, that I had come from a long line of people who carry this regret, including my veterinarian mother, who lived with 2 architects while attending veterinary school, and questioned her choice as she learned to express the anal glands of house pets. And finally, the third in the tie for goofiest, bestest quote of the year comes from this Rosamund Lehman novel, Invitation to the Waltz, from 1932. He was not exactly ugly, they thought, but one might be alone with him on a desert island for 10 years without ever being able to bear to kiss him. The next award is for the book I'm most likely to reread the soonest, and hands down that goes to Tommy Orange's second novel, Wandering Stars, which I loved in a 5-star way, but felt that I missed stuff because it had been a few years since I'd read his debut, There, and they're definitely linked. Whether you want to use the word sequel, that's debatable, but they're definitely linked with some of the same characters. So Wandering Stars was a buddy read with Heidi in my reading life, and we made a plan. I'm not sure we're going to follow through or when we're going to do it. I hope we do eventually. To reread There, and then immediately reread Wandering Stars and see what we pick up that we missed the first time. The next award is for my best nonfiction reads of the year, and I usually I think last year I had maybe a list of 5, one top read and the others that tied for second place. I didn't read much nonfiction this year, so I have my top nonfiction read plus 2 others that basically tie for second place. The best nonfiction book, and in fact, if I had to choose what was my best top read of the year, I would be hard-pressed not to choose it. This memoir, Committed, on Meaning and Madwomen by Suzanne Scanlon. She was a mystery guest. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And this is a memoir of her being psychiatrically institutionalized in the 90s, as she's, I think, a first-year university student in New York, in an intellectually and emotionally compelling way, evading all of those pitfalls that a memoirist could fall into the trap of. I don't know if that quite worked as a sentence, but we'll just keep going. Suzanne Scanlon probes that experience while linking it up with a multitude of preoccupations that really resonated so deeply with me, including and maybe especially, maybe not especially, the primary focus is on mental health, psychiatry, recovering from trauma and mental health challenges. But coming in at a close second would be how reading can serve as a guide or a pathway through all of that. And she introduced me to so many works of literature, provided me with provocative readings and interpretations of works of literature that I'd already read. And I could spend the next year, and I wish I would, focusing on all the books, including works of theory that I have a strong allergy to, but just the way she wrote about them, theories of reading and so on. I'm running out of words, so I'm just going to say I was absolutely blown away by this book, Committed, and I recommend it to you as highly as I would recommend anything else that I've read this year. The next two, again in no particular order, I read a graphic memoir called Feeding Ghosts by Tessa Hulls. I have a full review of this, and I should say I have a full review of the memoir Committed as well. All of that will be linked in the show notes. And this is a graphic memoir of Chinese and Asian American identity and trauma. I think that this book is what converted me into a more committed reader of graphic literature. Woo boy, well, I sure screwed up that description of the plot of this book, so let me do it again and more concisely. The three generations are Tessa, the author, her mother, Rose, and her grandmother, Sun Yi. And Sun Yi was a journalist in Shanghai, and she was not very much approved of by the Chinese communists. So Sun Yi and her mother, Rose, went into exile in Hong Kong. Sun Yi descended into a mental breakdown and was committed to an institution. Her daughter, Rose, eventually came to America and later brought her mother, Sun Yi, to live with her. And then Tessa came along, and the three generations of women and all the unexamined psychological damage and mental health challenges are what this graphic memoir are all about. There were a few parts where I thought it was a bit overly psychologized, but that's just me, and it did not budge me off of a 5-star rating. I absolutely loved Feeding Ghosts. And also tied for second place is this work of autofiction, The Hearing Test, by Eliza Barry Callahan, and it was a bit of a kind of coin toss whether to include this in nonfiction. It's kind of autofiction or nonfiction, but I had more space to put it in nonfiction, but oh my god, I love this, and it's not for every reader. It's about the first year of the author's life after she develops a really unusual kind of hearing loss, where certain sounds are amplified, other sounds she can't hear anymore, and it comes and goes. And she goes through a lot of medical testing and experiences a lot of tumult in her personal life because of her hearing loss. And the way she's written this, she has written a narrative where she uses that challenge, that crisis, to explore so many deep and sometimes comedic, I read you a line or two from it earlier, aspects of the quotidian and the deeply intellectual and the ridiculous that I was absolutely transfixed. I think this is the kind of a book where you need to do a Kindle preview or something to see if you get along with the writing style. It's not necessarily a Shawn book, which is why I loved it as much as I did, because it pulled me in deep into the kind of narrative that I don't necessarily go for. The next award is for The Bale I'm Most Likely to Try Again. One of my best sentences of the year came from The Love of Singular Men by Victor Herringer, translated from the Portuguese by James Young. But weird stuff happened at the end, and I think most of that weird stuff was in me, not in the book. So I bailed with about 50 pages left. This was a buddy read with Joe Smith, and I realized even at the time that probably I just got out of the wrong side of the bed that morning or whatever, and I don't usually, not recently anyways, bail so recklessly or whatever, but I will come back to this at some point. This is breaking news, because by the time you see this video, you won't have heard how I felt about the Sarah Waters novel from about 2004 or 2002, Fingersmith, because I just finished it the other day. But this gets the award for the most surprising 5-star read. And the reason it was surprising is that I couldn't finish another one of hers a few years back. The Little Stranger. That I think was an audiobook problem, possibly. I'm not going to talk about anything to do with that. But because I didn't get along with The Little Stranger, I was dared by my buddy reader, who I will still keep their identity a secret because why not? But we just had a Zoom chat, pseudo buddy read Zoom chat, which will go up on my channel probably not until February. But I love this. It was really well done. It's a very famous novel, but I think many of you will be pleasantly surprised to find out that I absolutely loved it. Let's go back to the negative, shall we? The most disappointing read, and hands down, that was Claire Fuller's fairly recent novel. She's had at least one, maybe two, come out since this, On Settled Ground. And the reason I say disappointing is because I had read and loved, or at least quite liked, this is from 2021, and I had read and quite liked an earlier one, Swimming Lessons. But this one was quite awful. I thought the character development was weak. The plot was ridiculous. I think the writing was fine. I enjoyed the audio narration, but it was virtually a complete failure, and I'm not sure that I will try anything else by her. The next one, it's not an award, but this is my announcement about what 2025 resolutions, New Year's resolutions. Did I say I'm recording this on New Year's Eve? I think I did. I hope I did. The New Year's resolutions are related to reading only, and I have two. One is to whittle down my current reads from 15, which is what it's currently at, to 6. I tried limiting it to 6 about 5 years ago, but I think now that I'm older, and I think it's maybe slowing down, I don't know, I think I need to get it down to 6. Unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but I didn't push myself to get it down to 6 current reads to begin the year, but that is my short and long-term goal, and to keep it at 6 current reads. Earlier in 2024, it was up to like 50 reads, 55 reads currently, and that was ridiculous, so I brought it down to 15, but it's still too much. Too many of those 15 books that I'm barely picking up once a month, so that just doesn't work. It has been a kind of a topsy-turvy year for me emotionally and otherwise, but I think 6 current reads is probably going to suit me better. So let's see how I do with that, shall we? And the other one is, as much as I love doing all these collaborations with novelists and buddy readers and this and that, I have to get that a bit under control. I'm not really good with getting things under control, but I don't want to overcommit myself. I have Patreon buddy reads that I'm delighted to offer to my top tier patrons. Aside from that, I'll give you one example. For years now, 5 years or more, I have been doing back-to-back buddy reads with one fabulous booktuber, Heidi of My Reading Life, and one of the most fabulous commenters in the booktube universe, Joe. And instead of doing those concurrently, I'm going to do those sequentially. So, for example, in January, I'm buddy reading a novel with Heidi, and then in February, I'll buddy read a novel with Joe, and not at the same time, because, just to get things a little bit more manageable. What's your prediction? How do you think that's going to work out? Next is the award for worst book, and hands down that goes to the posthumously published crappy draft of a novella by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Until August, translated by Anne McLean. He didn't want it to be published. His sons or his kids decided that they couldn't deny his fans the chance to read this, and that also was a crime against humanity. Enough said. The final award, and in years past, it's been my top read. I do have an award for top read, and then at least last year, maybe before, I had then my other top 4 reads that I didn't rank in order, but I read so many incredible works of fiction that I'm giving you 10. Number 1, my top read of 2024 is The Deluge by Stephen Markley, and by the way, he was my mystery guest a couple weeks ago, so you must watch that. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. About half of the characters in this 900-page novel are trying to politically, scientifically, or through political activism, trying to respond to the global warming challenge, and the other half of the characters are trying to block it. And in a fantastically character-driven novel. We follow these characters from the year maybe 2013 or something, I forget when it starts, until about 2040 or maybe 2050, as the weather gets worse and the political responses are inept and tepid, and society begins to crumble. And we follow these, there's about 10 core characters and dozens more important but, comparatively minor characters that you get so deeply invested in. This was a buddy read, if I didn't say, with Heidi of My Reading Life. It was just masterful. I'm getting tipsy, so I forgot to hold this up while I was talking about it, but maybe not just tipsy, but weak. This is a heavy mother of a novel. The next one is Ivy's Tree by Wendy Burton, which I've talked about a little bit before, and I'm not going to say much more about it, but I really want to press this into your hands. It came out during COVID. It's a debut novel, published by a small press in Saskatoon by a writer who lives in British Columbia, about an elderly woman, so that has a lot of odds stacked against it. Give this one a try, because it is one of the best novels I read this year, and it needs a much more vast readership. And if you're not somebody who's tried something that's off the beaten track, why not make that your New Year's resolution? I love this novel with all my heart. Next is this 1990s queer novel, Now and Then by William Corlett. I think I've described it enough, but it needs to be rescued from the obscurity of the backlist. Please read it. It's just incredible. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention before, I had a pseudo buddy read kind of discussion with Erica, and we read it together because she's really into boarding school lit. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. You must try this. You must. You must. Also, Matterhorn by Carl Marlentes. I've explained a little bit about it. It's a fairly well-known novel, but I think especially if you are the kind of reader that doesn't necessarily go in for war fiction, this is one you really shouldn't miss. And if you do it as an audio-text combo. The narrator, who does all the various regional American accents and so on, is Bronson Pinchot. It's to die for. The audiobook is 21 hours. I've talked quite a bit about Minor Detail by Adanya Shibli, translated from the Arabic by Elizabeth Jacquet, so I won't say any more here, but this was definitely in my top 10 reads of the year. If you read it in 2025, I am confident that it will be in your top 10 as well. Again, in the interest of time, I won't say any more about My Friends by Hisham Attar, but wow, what a powerful novel. Also won't say any more about Orbital by Samantha Harvey, but I've read half the novel to you in 2 fabulous sentences. You must read this. I am coming more and more with every passing year to trust the booker deeply. They do choose very wisely. I'll spend a couple minutes talking about In Tongues, the second novel by the gay American novelist Thomas Grattan. His first novel, The Recent East, was one of my favorite novels. When his second novel was coming out, I arranged to get an ARC so that I could interview him and publish our chat on his publication day. So that'll be linked in the show notes. This is a queer novel set in 2001. The protagonist is 24, comes from Minnesota to New York City, and becomes gayer and gayer chapter by chapter. I don't really have time to say any more, but it's marvelous. Thomas Grattan is now one of my very most favorite writers. Check out my interview with him about this novel for more. It hasn't come up thus far in the video, but definitely Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, the Booker winner last year, which I finished just a few weeks ago, is a profound work of literature that I loved and kind of hated because it fucked me up so much because I finished it in the post-election weeks as the Trump cabinet was being nominated or whatever, and I just thought, oh, this is all going to come true, isn't it? Deeply relevant and gorgeously written. And finally, and again, these are not ranked beyond my top read, The Deluge. I don't usually put my British women's fiction of the mid-20th century into these awards, and I don't know why that is, but the more I thought about it, this one must be on the list. And that is Rosamund Lehmann's fourth novel, I can't remember. Invitation to the Waltz, which was published 1932, is about a young middle-class British woman. I think she's 17, maybe 16, and it's her birthday, so we meet all of her family. But that night or the next night is the town ball or the graduation ball or something, and it's held at the local nobleman's house. And she grew up with those noble people, but she herself is from a middle-class family, and she is not boy crazy, but she's at that age where she's quite interested in young men, and she and her older sister go to the ball, and most of the novel is centered on that ball. The characterization of our protagonist, Olivia, as she dances with this man and that man, and as she experiences all of the shame of being a young woman, doesn't think she's in the best dress, is totally freaking out about this, that, and the other thing, drawn to several of these men, repulsed by others. We, the reader, come to appreciate her fragility and her insight. I don't know if she's the stand-in for Rosamund Lehman, but her ability to see into other characters and to open to them like a flower. You must try it. So that is it for my 2024 Besties and Worsties. Happy New Year, and thanks for watching.